I've always enjoyed playing horror games, even before I started uploading playthroughs and reviews to YouTube. I'd even say that prior to my foray into the world of content creation, I'd have pretty substantial knowledge of the horror genre. That being said, I've only become more well versed as I've forced myself to take a more critical approach to my playthroughs. Up until now, though, I've only considered one horror game at a time. I may have used critical terms that reference generic conventions specific to the horror genre, but I've only judged a game based on how well I thought it lived up to what the devs set out to accomplish. Not so much based on a universal set of criteria to which all horror games should measure up. And while I think the former is a much more useful, critical approach, especially in terms of considering whether or not a game is worth the cost, I do think there is still some merit in talking about the genre more generally. So, now, to do something slightly different, here are a few things that I think are absolutely essential in order for one to make a good horror game. First off, a horror game needs a good soundscape, but let's back up and talk about what that word means before getting too ahead of ourselves. The soundscape refers to anything sound related, soundtrack, sound effects, voice acting, etc. I feel like some devs take this one for granted, but if your soundscape isn't working, if you haven't put the extra effort in to ensure that everything it's comprised of is thematically sound, then that can absolutely undo some really good work you may have put into the visuals or the writing. That's why you'll notice that I often give the highest praise to devs that create a game that hits the mark for all aspects of horror. If one part just isn't working, or isn't as strong as another, it can have detrimental effects. As I mentioned in my Made in a Black Water review, I genuinely think the Fatal Frame series is the gold standard for excellent soundscape work. From the soundtrack to the voice acting to the menu sound effects, every sound just works so well together. And is it perfect? No, but it doesn't have to be because everything fits together so thematically. And that's why I think it's the gold standard. Not because everything is a straight up banger, but because every aspect of the soundscape is so interwoven. But when any part of the soundscape just isn't working, that can really impact a player's experience. Let's consider Tormented Souls. The game has a lot going for it, but there were moments where the overacted voice acting undermined the work that other aspects of horror were trying to accomplish. On top of that, the soundtrack was appropriate, but not very compelling. My second horror must-have would be good writing. That seems so vague and like, well, no shit. That's a nice thing to have in any game, but stay with me. Some of the best horror game experiences I've had were certainly not the scariest. Like, I wasn't always on the verge of soiling yet another decent pair of corduroys. But the writing was so strong and the pacing was so exquisite that I was riveted, genuine chills cascading down my spine to the base of my back. A recent example of just such writing would have to be Detention. The game is only about a 3-hour experience, and you play almost exclusively from the perspective of one character, but there are no weak characters in this game. The characterization work that the devs are able to do in such a short amount of time is truly remarkable. And the details that you slowly piece together about the character whose shoes you fill as you progress through a thrilling purgatory are so impactful and revelatory. Now compare that to the characterization of Daniel Neuer in Song of Horror. Everything about this extremely flat, whiny character is revealed to you up front. There's no substance or depth. And I had no earthly desire whatsoever to sympathize with this annoying sack of shit, or care about his overall well-being. None of the other characters, for that matter, are very fleshed out at all. Now, Song of Horror certainly has strengths and is a worthy entry in the horror genre, but the lack of good characterization was significantly detrimental to the quality of the writing, as well as to the overall experience. Third, and probably most obvious, the visuals have a lot of weight to pull. From solid jump scares to the subtler elements like the environments, you just can't neglect something so crucial. And just like with the soundscape, things don't have to be perfect or flawless. Hell, they don't even have to be original. I can think of many RPG Maker horror games that use pre-made assets, or even a game like Find Yourself by Emika Games. It's actually almost more impressive that these smaller, less experienced devs could use materials already out in the gaming world and repurpose them for truly bone-chilling experiences. Don't get me wrong, originality is a wonderful thing. Bendy and the Ink Machine is probably number one on my list for originality, but no matter what you bring to the table, the most crucial thing is that your choices in terms of visuals have to be thematically sound. If you don't have a unifying vision of what kind of horror experience you want to capture, then your players are going to notice, and they're not going to let you take them along for the ride, no matter how much you try to sell it in other ways. And what is the number one telltale sign of weak visuals and, by extension, a feeble attempt at a horror game? An overabundance of jump scares. Now, somewhere along the way, I feel like jump scare became a bad word. Like, to even have jump scares in a horror game automatically means you've developed a shitty product. Well, that's just incorrect. In my Made in a Blackwater review, what's the one thing I wanted more of? Jump scares. The game had everything else going for it, just not enough jump scares to make me feel unsafe and disrupt the routine flow of progressing through the game. That's what jump scares are supposed to do, make you simultaneously feel relief at having escaped the frying pan and dread for what demon might be lurking in the fire. Yes, an over-reliance becomes annoying and repetitive, but jump scares are still an incredibly useful tool in a dev's arsenal, just not the only one. And finally, I saved this criterion for last because it is the most nebulous and honestly relies on some of the above more concrete elements in order to be successfully implemented. A good horror game creates and then plays upon the player's sense of fear and or dread. This might just be the most difficult and elusive of the bunch for several reasons. As mentioned first and foremost, it relies the most on other criteria being strong. Second, there's a delicate balance that the dev must strike so as not to go from dangerous to difficult, the former inspiring terror and the latter resulting in frustration. A good example of the devs finding the balance would have to be Tormented Souls. The game never had me tearing out my hair in frustration. Encounters with the creepy, fucked up enemies made the imminent danger I found myself in feel palpable, and even though enemy encounters were fairly common, I never found myself saying, "God, here we go again." Unlike with Made in a Blackwater, where the combat was a little too clunky and the enemy encounters were far too abundant. These are just some of the aspects of horror that I find absolutely essential in order for me to really feel like nothing is safe or okay. I've given this a lot of thought and enjoyed this exercise, so much so that maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point with even more criteria. But for now, I'll stop here and turn it around on you, dear viewer. What do you look for in a horror game? What makes a good horror experience? Can you think of anything that absolutely ruined a horror game for you? I'd really like to know, and thanks for watching.